The first thing he noticed was the smell of wood smoke on the wind, thin as a thread, coming down from the ridge before the ridge itself became visible. Then the fence posts, leaning the way old shoulders lean, patched with wire that had been mended so many times it looked braided. Then the low sound of a milk cow bawling for its calf somewhere out past the barn, and the answering call, faint, from up the draw. Then, at last, the woman. She was carrying a bucket in each hand, and she did not slow her walk when the sound of his horses reached her. She only shifted her grip, the way a person shifts a heavier truth to a more comfortable place, and kept moving toward the barn. He watched her the way a man watches something he does not yet understand and knows he had better learn to understand quickly, and then he touched the brim of his hat, though she had not yet looked up, and he swung his horse toward her fence line at an easy pace, because a man who rides fast at a widow's gate is a man who rides home again the same day. Ellis Warren was 46 years old, a widower for the second time, and the second largest cattle owner in La Plata County, Colorado. He had come down out of Durango that October morning with 2 riders and a notary in a buggy, meaning to spend an hour at the Halloran place and ride out with a signature before noon. The San Juan Range stood behind him, already dusted white above 9,000 feet, and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned that particular pale gold that meant the year was closing its accounts. He had $611 in a leather case tied to his saddle, drawn in cash from the First National in Durango, and he had, he believed, a fair offer for a piece of ground that had been carrying a banknote for 3 winters. He had come to buy her farm. Her name was Sarah Halloran. She was 34 years old, the widow of James Halloran of the Chama Valley, and had been running the 240 acres alone for 3 years, 1 month, and 11 days. She kept those numbers not out of sentiment but because the bank in Pueblo kept them, and she meant to be a step ahead of the bank at all times. She had 1 hired hand, a boy of 17 named Micah, and 42 head of cattle, and a mother-in-law named Ruth who lived in the small house behind the main house and had not spoken more than 4 sentences to Sarah in a year, though the 2 women shared bread every evening and mended each other's clothes on Sunday afternoons. Sarah had learned in 3 winters that a farm does not care what you have lost. A farm only asks whether you will get up in the dark and answer it. Sarah got up in the dark. Sarah answered. She rose at 4 every morning in the summer and at 5 in the winter, and she milked before dawn and she chopped wood after dark, and she had, in 3 years, worn out 2 pairs of leather gloves and 1 pair of boots and had not, in any of those 3 years, worn a Sunday dress twice in the same month, because Sunday dresses were what you had when your husband was still living and there was still a reason to look particular on the Lord's Day. She had 1 photograph of James, taken in Pueblo in 1875, which she kept in the drawer of her mother's dresser, and she looked at it perhaps once a month, and never on a Sunday because Sundays were hard enough without help. Sarah set the buckets down when she reached the barn. Then she straightened her back the careful way a person does when the back has been asked to do more than a back should, and she turned. She saw the 3 riders and the buggy and the notary's low black hat and she understood. In the plain quick way she understood most things, exactly what had come to her fence line and why. She had heard, 2 Sundays back at the feed store, that Ellis Warren was making a slow circle of every small holding west of the Onemus River. She had told herself, walking home from the feed store, that when he reached her gate she would meet him at the barn with her apron on and her back straight and her mind already made up. She untied her apron, folded it once, and laid it on the water trough. Then she walked out to meet them with her mind already made up. Mr. Warren, she said. She had never met him. She had heard his name at the feed store in Durango the way a person hears weather reports for a county they do not live in, distant and mostly unrelated. Old man Hensley at the feed counter had said, one Saturday in September, that Ellis Warren was a widower twice over and a good hand with cattle and a hard hand with a banknote, and that if he ever rode out to see a woman on business it was not the kind of business a woman turned down without thinking. Sarah had said at the counter that she would think about a Warren offer the same way she thought about a spring frost, which is to say she would plan around it and she would not let it kill her early crop. Hensley had laughed. She had not. You're a long way from home. He tipped his hat. He was a tall man, lean in a way that money had not softened, gray at the temples, with eyes the color of river stone and a voice that had been trained by weather and by boardrooms both. Mrs. Halloran, he said, I hoped you'd give me a half-hour of your time. I'll give you the half-hour, she said. But I won't give you the farm. He smiled because he had not yet asked. She saw the smile and did not smile back. She led him to the porch and poured coffee from a pot that had been warm since dawn, and she let him make his case in the order he had rehearsed it on the ride south from Durango. He spoke of drought years to come, and of the winter of 1874 in particular, which had broken 3 homesteads in the valley below theirs. He spoke of the price of hay, which had climbed 12 cents a bale since spring. He spoke of a cattle market that would not, he believed, reward small operations for much longer. He spoke of a figure that was, by any honest measurement, generous. Then he set the leather case on the porch rail and waited, and he did not press her, because a man who presses a widow on her own porch is a man who has already lost the room. Sarah looked at the case a long time. Then she looked past it, at her fence line, at the place where her fence met his intention. "Mr. Warren," she said, "my husband put every post in that fence with his own hands. He died with a hammer in his hand, fixing the gate you can see from where you're sitting. I don't sell the ground he's buried under. Not for your figure. Not for twice it. Ride home with your case, Mr. Warren. Ride home before dark. The pass is bad after dark this time of year." He nodded slowly. He was not a man who argued when a first refusal was clean. "I'll come back in a week," he said, "in case you change your mind." "I won't," she said. "But you're welcome to the coffee any time. Just not the land." He tipped his hat again. And here is where the story would have ended in every other version of this story that had ever been told in La Plata County. The wealthy rancher rides home, the widow keeps her land 1 more year, the bank in Pueblo tightens its grip in the spring, and by the following autumn the wealthy rancher owns the ground anyway, because the bank is more patient than any widow. But that afternoon, before Ellis Warren could mount his horse, a black sky came fast over the ridge, the way weather comes in the San Juans in October, and inside of 20 minutes a wind was on them that had teeth in it, and inside of 30 minutes a full section of Sarah's north fence was down and 42 head of cattle were scattering toward the creek. Micah went one way, Sarah went the other, and Ellis Warren, who had never in his life worked another man's fence, sent his notary home in the buggy with the leather case and his 2 riders south after the cattle, and he himself took off his good coat, folded it once across his saddle the way she had folded her apron, rolled his sleeves to the elbow and picked up the maul. He did not ask. He did not announce. He set the first post back in its hole and drove it and moved to the next. The rain came sideways and he kept driving posts. His hands, which had not driven a fence post in 14 years, blistered by the 4th and bled by the 7th, and he did not stop. He worked until the light failed, and then he worked by the light of a hurricane lamp Ruth carried out to him from the little house behind the main house, wordless, and set on a stump beside him, and went back inside. When Sarah rode back that evening with the last of her cattle, wet to the bone and shaking with the kind of tired that has no bottom, she saw a man she barely knew standing at her fence line in the last thin light, wire in one hand and a maul in the other, and she pulled up her horse and she watched him for a long moment before he saw her, and something in her chest did a small quiet thing she had not felt in 3 years. He saw her then. He straightened. "Fence is up," he said. "I'll ride out in the morning." "You'll ride out when the coffee's finished," she said. "Come inside, Mr. Warren. You're not fit for a horse." He slept that night on her porch, wrapped in a horse blanket, because there was no other bed and because a man in his position could not, in the eyes of Durango, sleep any nearer to Sarah Halloran's door than that. Ruth, the mother-in-law, brought him a second blanket at midnight without a word and went back to her small house. In the morning, Sarah found him at the fence again, checking every post he had driven the day before, tightening a wire here, resetting a brace there. He worked without looking up. He worked the way a man works when he has decided something he has not yet spoken. Grief, she thought, watching him, doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. "You said a half hour," she said, when she brought him coffee. "I did," he said. "This is a different half hour." He rode home to Durango that afternoon. He came back on Tuesday. Not a Tuesday for anything in particular, which she noticed because Tuesdays in her life were always for something in particular. The churn day, the mending day, the day the boy from the feed store rode out with the paper from Denver a week late. Ellis Warren riding in on a plain Tuesday for no stated reason was a deviation. And Sarah, who had learned to read deviations the way other women read scripture, noticed. He brought a wagon of milled lumber she had not ordered, and when she came out to the yard with her hands on her hips, he raised both of his and said, "You mentioned the south barn wall on Sunday. I was in the yard when Micah said it. I had the lumber, that's all." "Mr. Warren," she said, "I don't accept charity." "It isn't charity," he said. "I'll take it out in beef come spring. Fair price. Written down. Ask Ruth to witness it if you like." Ruth witnessed it. Ruth, who had not written her own name in a year, took the pencil and drew her signature in a hand that shook only a little, and she looked at Sarah when she was done and said, "Quiet as a mended wire, the wall wants doing." That was 5 sentences from Ruth in a year, if you counted the wall wanting doing as 1 sentence, which Sarah did. He came back on Friday. He came back on Sunday. He did not sit for meals inside. He ate at the porch rail with his hat off and his coffee steaming, and he never once mentioned the leather case, which had gone back to Durango in the notary's buggy and had not returned. Word of the returning, however, had reached Durango within a fortnight. Old man Hensley at the feed store told the story to anyone who would sit still for it, and one Saturday afternoon at the counter he said aloud, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, that Ellis Warren had gone out to buy a farm and had come home instead with blisters on both hands and a look on his face that a man of 46 does not put on for a piece of ground. The widow Mabry, buying flour that same afternoon, said only, "About time. Someone tell the poor woman before he loses his nerve." The blacksmith, Pettigrew, sharpening a plow blade in the corner, said without looking up, "She knows. She's been knowing since October. The question is whether she'll let herself say it before the thaw." 3 sentences from 3 named voices at 3 separate corners of one small store, and none of them, of course, reached Sarah's porch that week, but all 3 of them turned out to be true. What did return, week by week, physically and undeniably to that porch, was Ellis Warren, and what returned with him was a slow, steady rebuilding of things Sarah had not had the hands to rebuild alone. A hinge on the smokehouse, reset in an afternoon, that had been sagging since James died. A new brace under the porch on the west corner, where the boards had begun to give the winter before, done in one Saturday morning while Sarah was inside with Ruth and did not know he was doing it until she heard the saw. And, in the 3rd week of October, the east-facing kitchen window that had been broken since James died and that Sarah had covered with oilcloth for 3 winters and had told herself she would fix when there was time. Ellis rode in one October morning with a pane of real glass, wrapped in wool, and he set it in her east wall without asking, and he stood back when it was done and looked at the way the morning light came through it onto her kitchen table, and he did not speak for a long moment. "You'll have good light now," he said, "for your reading. In the mornings." Sarah stood in her kitchen with the light on her hands, and she did not speak. She had, on the sill of that window since the winter of James's dying, kept a small tin box of his pipe tobacco, unopened. Ellis, setting the pane, had lifted the box aside without asking what was in it, and had set it back down in the exact same place when the pane was seated. He had not asked. He had noticed, and he had not asked, and the not asking was, Sarah thought later that night, the thing that told her most of what she needed to know about the kind of man he had grown up to be. A man who moves a widow's tin box and puts it back exactly where he found it is a man who understands that some ground belongs to the dead and is not for the living to cross without invitation. She did not trust her voice. She had not been given a thing without a price attached to it in 3 years, and this one had no price on it, and it was that fact more than the light itself that undid her. She turned her face away from him so he would not see, and she said, "The coffee's on, Mr. Warren." "I know," he said. "I can smell it." The town of Durango, of course, was not blind. Word travels fast in a county where the same 6 men eat at the same 3 tables in the same one hotel. By the first snow there was talk. By the second snow there was a rival, a man named Colton Reeves, who owned the freight line out of Durango and who had, twice before James Halloran died, mentioned to James that Sarah was a fine woman and that if anything ever happened, and so on. Colton Reeves was not a bad man. He was, in fact, the kind of man who used the words fair and best interest the way other men used punctuation. He came out to the Halloran farm one Saturday in November, in a good coat and a clean hat, and he made his case on the same porch where Ellis had made his, and he made it well. "Sarah," he said, "I've waited 3 years. I've waited because it was the decent thing to wait. But now there's talk of you and Warren, and I can't in good conscience wait any longer without saying my piece. I've the freight line. I've the house in town. Your boy Micah would have a place with me. Ruth would have her own rooms and a stove she didn't have to feed. I'd not ask you to work another day of your life. That's fair. I believe, in your best interest. Sarah listened all the way through. She did not interrupt him. When he was done, she poured him more coffee, and she said, Colton, I've known you 15 years and you've never lied to me, and you're not lying now. What you're offering is a good offer. It isn't the one I want. I'll not marry a man to be kept. I never was kept. James never kept me. I kept us both at the end, and I mean to keep on keeping. Colton was quiet a long time. He looked at his hat in his hands. He turned it once. Then he said, Warren, then. I don't know yet, she said. I know he fixed my window. Colton looked out at the east wall of her kitchen, where the new pane caught the pale winter light. He was, at his core, a decent man, and decent men see what they see. That is a considerable window, he said. It is, she said. He stood. He put on his hat. He said, If it isn't him, Sarah, come find me. I'll not ask again after today, but I'll not close the door either. That's fair. I believe, in your best interest. And then, because he was a decent man and because decent men are allowed one hard beat of dignity before they yield, he added, quieter, it costs me something to say that. I want you to know it costs me. 15 years I've stood aside for one Halloran man or another, and this is the last time I stand aside. I'll ride home now. I'll not be back this way. He rode home. He did not come back. In the spring he married a schoolteacher from Silverton and, by all accounts, was happy, which is the ending decent rivals deserve in stories that mean to remain warm. Winter came hard that year. The cottonwoods went bare in a week. The creek froze at its edges, and by the end of December it had frozen all the way through, so that Micah could walk the milk pails across it without the plank bridge. Snow came in 3 storms in December, each one heavier than the last, until the fence lines Ellis had rebuilt in October stood in drifts to their top wires. Ellis rode down from Durango 3 times a week and did not miss a week. Not through the blizzard in December that took the roof off a barn in Bayfield. Not through the ice storm that took down half the telegraph line in January and left Durango silent to Denver for 11 days. He did not speak of the leather case. He did not speak of the figure. He spoke, when he spoke, of cattle prices and of a colt he was breaking and of a book he had been reading about grafting apple trees to hardier stock, and once, only once, of his first wife who had died in childbirth 20 years earlier, and of his second wife who had left him for a mining engineer in Leadville and had died of a fever there in 1878. Grief doesn't leave, he said that night at the porch rail, looking at the dark. It just learns to share the house with other things. Sarah heard that sentence and she carried it inside her for a week. On the 7th day she carried it out to the barn with her, and she said it low to the milk cow, and the milk cow, in the way of milk cows, did not answer. On the 8th day she stopped needing to say it. It had, she realized, moved in. She thought that week of the letter she had never written to her mother in Kansas, the one she had drafted 3 times in the winter after James died and had burned each time in the kitchen stove. The letter had begun, all 3 times, with the same sentence. I do not know how to be a woman who used to be a wife. She had not been able to find the second sentence. That February, watching Ellis mend the north fence in a cold blue afternoon light, she found it. The second sentence, she understood now, was, you do not have to. You only have to be the woman who is walking out to the fence today. The letter, still unwritten, sat inside her chest, no longer a draft but a settled thing, and she did not need to send it to Kansas. Kansas already knew. The confrontation, when it came at the fence line. It always does. It was late February and the light was that thin blue light that means winter has begun to consider leaving. Ellis had been mending the north fence, the same north fence that had gone down the day they met, and Sarah walked out to him with her coat buttoned to her throat and her hands deep in her pockets, and she stopped 6 feet from him and she said his name. Ellis, she said. Not Mr. Warren. He set down the maul. Sarah, he said. Why do you come out here, she said. For months. 3 days a week. In weather that would kill a lesser man. He looked at her a long time. He did not look away, and she noticed that he did not look away, and she noticed also that his eyes were the color of river stone and had, in them, a stillness she had not seen in a man since James. Because, he said, the first day I came here I meant to buy your farm. I meant to leave with a signature. I left with something else, and I've been trying to name it ever since. I'll tell you now what I've named it. I came to buy your farm. I've been coming back because I don't want the farm. I want the woman who kept it. If that's a thing I'm allowed to want, Sarah, I'd like to know. If it isn't, tell me plain and I'll ride out today and I'll not shame you by coming back. The wind moved once through the bare cottonwoods and made a sound like paper. Sarah looked at the fence. At the post nearest her hand, one of the posts Ellis had driven the first day, still standing straight after 4 months of weather, and she put her gloved hand on it and she left it there. She thought, in that moment, of James, and of the gate he had died fixing, and of the way a person carries the dead the same way a person carries a lantern in a blizzard, with both hands close to the chest, sheltered so the wind does not take it. She thought of the east-facing window and of the light on her kitchen table in the mornings. She thought of the way Ellis Warren had folded his good coat across his saddle before he picked up the maul, and of how a man who folds a coat before he ruins it is a man who has been raised by a woman who taught him what folding is for. You built me a window, Ellis, she said. A man doesn't build a woman a window unless he means her to stay in the room. No, he said. He doesn't. Then I'll stay, she said. In the room. If you'll be in it. He crossed the 6 feet between them. He did not embrace her. He took her gloved hand off the post and he held it in both of his, and he stood there with her at the fence line for a long quiet moment, and the pale blue late winter light came down on the two of them, and neither of them spoke because neither of them needed to. There was, that same February, one more small thing. Sarah found Ellis on a Saturday morning at the woodshed behind the main house, splitting a cord of oak that Micah had hauled down from the ridge the week before. He had taken off his coat and hung it on the fence rail, and he was working in his shirt sleeves in the cold, and the pile of split wood at his feet was already twice what a man of his age should have been able to split in a morning. Sarah stood at the corner of the shed and watched him a long time before he saw her. She thought of James, who had split wood in that same spot for 8 winters, and she thought of how a woodshed is a small, plain, particular place, and how a man who chooses to spend his Saturday morning in another man's woodshed without being asked is a man who has quietly decided which small, plain, particular places he means to belong to. She did not speak. She went back to the house and put the coffee on. They were married on the first Sunday in April at the small church in Durango, with Ruth in the front pew wearing a dark gray dress she had not worn since James's wedding, and Micah standing up for Sarah, and 2 of Ellis's riders standing up for Ellis. Sarah wore her mother's dress, high-necked and long-sleeved and pale as bone, and she carried a small bunch of the first crocuses from her own yard. Ellis did not sell his Durango place, but he kept it as a business address and moved his life to the Halloran farm, and he made it clear, at the church door and at the courthouse and at the bank in Pueblo, that the land was Sarah's, would remain Sarah's, and that his name would go on nothing that was hers. The bank in Pueblo, hearing this and hearing also whose account would now be backing hers, quietly redrew every schedule it had ever set against her, and Sarah paid off the last of James's note on the first day of May with a check she wrote in her own hand. Ellis came back to the north fence one more time, alone, in the 2nd week of May. Not because there was work to do, there was always work to do, but Micah could do it now and had grown 4 inches over the winter, but because Sarah had asked him to. She was standing at the north fence when he rode up, in a plain brown dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows for the warmth of the sun, and she had a small wrapped bundle in her hands. "I've a thing for you," she said. She unwrapped the bundle. It was a hammer. James's hammer, the one he had died holding, cleaned and oiled and rehandled. "It's time it went back to work," she said. "If you'll carry it." He took it. He turned it in his hand. He looked at the initials burned into the handle, JH, and beside them a new set, freshly burned in a hand that could only have been Ruth's, EW. He looked up at Sarah and he could not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "Quiet, I'll carry it." "Then we're settled," she said. Colton Reeves, in Silverton with his schoolteacher, sent them a wedding pot of preserves and a short letter that said only, "Fair," and "in the best interest of all." Ruth, in her small house behind the main house, began that summer to write short letters to Sarah in a hand that shook a little, and Sarah wrote back, and by August they were speaking again the way they had spoken before James died, which is to say quietly and about the important things and only about the important things. Micah, at 18, took over the day work on the north pasture and asked, in September, whether he might one day have a small piece of ground of his own on the west edge, and Ellis said he might, and drew it out on paper with him that same evening. The 42 head of cattle became 60 by fall. The east-facing kitchen window caught the morning light every morning, and Sarah read her book at that table every morning, and she did not, on any morning of her second marriage, forget who had built the window. One evening in September, that particular pale gold September when the cottonwoods turn, Sarah and Ellis were sitting on the porch at the end of a long day, and Ellis, without looking at her, said, "The first day I came here, I meant to buy your farm." "I remember," Sarah said. "You left wanting something else." "I did," he said. "So did I," she said. "I didn't know it, standing at the barn with 2 buckets. But I did." He put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. The San Juan Range stood dark behind them, and the wood smoke was on the wind again, thin as a thread, coming down from the ridge, the same thread of smoke he had ridden into a year before. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east, and it drives the post, and it stays through the winter, and it comes back on a Tuesday that isn't a Tuesday for anything in particular, and it says one September evening at the end of a long day, the true thing it has been trying to say all along. Some men come to buy a piece of land. Some men leave with a piece of land. But the ones worth remembering come to buy a piece of land, and they leave wanting the woman who kept it, and they are patient enough and quiet enough and willing enough to swing a maul in a sideways rain, that in the end the woman lets them stay. That is not a bargain. That is not a purchase. That is the only thing on a working ranch that cannot be paid for in beef come spring. That is the ground a man builds a life on when the leather case goes home empty. That is what Ellis Warren, second largest cattle owner in La Plata County, learned on an October afternoon at the fence line of a widow he did not know. That the richest thing a man can ride home with is the thing he did not come to buy. If this story warmed the room you are sitting in tonight, stay with us a little longer, because next, we ride out to a small homestead north of Silverton, where a widowed blacksmith takes in a stranger's daughter for one hard winter, and the girl says on the last night of March, a sentence her father never lived to hear. Until next time, keep riding.